Yes, the idea that Christianity is just a crutch, perhaps because you're too weak to get through life without belief in God. I'd say a couple of thoughts there. I think the problem with that, for me, Derek, is it kind of begs the question. It assumes that Christianity isn't true. Because if Christianity is true, then it's actually atheism that's a psychological crutch. Atheism is a psychological crutch to avoid you having to deal with the idea that you might be held to account for your life. And so I don't like that idea that there might be a God who might one day ask me some questions, so you know what, I will pretend he doesn't exist. So in one sense, psychological crutches don't get us anywhere, because as a Christian, you can just turn the tables gently. So what we actually need to do, I think, is try and figure out, see if we can work out what is the true story of reality. Is it a universe without a God behind it, or is it a universe with a God behind it? But what I think gives the Christian the even stronger case of going, here's the fascinating thing. If there is no God behind this universe, if we are nothing more than very cleverly evolved primates, and really our only job in life is the same as every other mammal, to survive, reproduce, fight, pass on our DNA to the next generation, where on earth did this spiritual desire that is found universally in humanity? Atheists are a tiny minority. The vast majority of people who have always existed have believed there is something spiritual to life. Where did that come from? Where has that idea? It offers no evolutionary advantage. So it either looks like the whole of humanity has just gone mad, or could it just be that actually there is something much bigger going on? So I think I'd begin there. I think the other thing I might as well say, I also might lean into testimony and say, do you know what? If you've got a broken leg, then actually, quite frankly, a crutch is a useful thing. There are times that a crutch is actually quite helpful. I dislocated my shoulder rock climbing last year, and I was strapped up for 3 weeks. So I'm quite grateful that the doctors strapped my arm up, because I needed it. And so going, actually, with some of the issues that we're wrestling with, not least the search for happiness, I don't think we can do it on our own. I think the whole story of human history is what happens when we try. And maybe actually we were not designed to do it on our own. Maybe actually there's something about taking that offer of a crutch. Thank you very much. So that's, I think, where I might begin with a friend who raised that. So that's a great question, Derek. Thank you. Kenny, brilliant question, Kenny. Do you know, it's interesting that if you read the New Testament, the second half of the Bible, the language, the image that's always used, or very regularly used, is walk. That's the New Testament language. And I think that's fascinating because, Christian faith is not described in the Bible as just a belief or a set of ideas or some good advice or a moral code. That kind of language of trust and walk is used. And I think what I take from that, looking my own journey here, is that certainly I would say since I really wholeheartedly gave my life to Christ back in my late 20s, I became a Christian in my late teens, wobbled in my early 20s. I told you some of that story this evening. What I would say is that sense of Jesus always being with me through his Spirit, through thick times and thin. There have been good times, there have been crap times, but there's been that sense of God always being present with me in that. And I think that's the first thing. There's that promise that you can know. Sometimes you know it more strongly, sometimes you know it less strongly, of God always being with you in things. But then secondly, the other thing I like about the walking image is, as someone who hill walks, that's my hobby. I miss the Munros desperately. Where I live in Wiltshire, we do not really have mountains, like, at all. When you go hill walking, when you go walking, you've actually got to do something. You've got to put one foot in front of the other. And I think there's something about Christian faith, too, that says it's not about just going, okay, yeah, God, I believe in you, job done. But it's that journey through life going, I will make that choice to follow Jesus. And sometimes it'll be easy, like walking downhill is easy. Sometimes it might be tougher. But I know it's rewarding because I'm going deeper into that relationship with God. So that's sort of how I'd begin thinking around it. I love that metaphor of walking. The other metaphor, by the way, the New Testament uses is it kicks us up again and goes running a race, which I struggle a bit more with because I don't really run because of the donuts. But the idea of there's the finishing line and there's Jesus cheering you on, going, come on. And again, it can be hard work. There may be some stumbles. But again, you've got God coming alongside you going, come on, let's get to that finishing line. Let's drive somewhere. And again, the contrast, whereas if we live in a godless universe, there is nowhere to go in life. There's no point to life. There's no finishing line. There's no direction. It's all just random happenstance. Does some of that help a little bit? Yeah. Cheers. Thanks for the question, mate. It's good. What a question. Great question. The simple answer, let me give you the short answer and the longer answer. The short answer is no, it doesn't mean that. I wish it did mean that. I wish being a Christian meant every day was happy, happy, joy, joy, dancing around the place. The Bible's very realistic, that we live in a world that's broken, a world that's gone wrong, and stuff happens, crap happens. Sometimes circumstances, sometimes some of us in this room have wrestled with mental health. Although I was struggling with it, I was still a Christian in my early 20s. When I went through depression, age 23, 24, that was miserable. That was a miserable time. And I was a Christian at that point. I wasn't, following Jesus as strongly as clearly as I might, but very much he was there. And I think a couple of things that I would say going on there. I think one of the things I think was interesting with depression, one of the issues I wrestled with was the issue of self-image. Because I think that's at the heart of the issue for so many of us. Who are we? Are we worth something? Are we valuable? And I think the challenge is when you wrestle with those questions outside of the Christian faith, you very quickly run into a roadblock because you run into the fact that some of us, on a purely instrumental basis, have no value whatsoever. If you are not going to have children and advance the human race, if you're not to discover the cure for cancer or do something useful, then you are of no instrumental value to human society at all, and evolution has no time for us. And to go, that is a pretty depressing and grim conclusion. And what I found was interesting, when I went through depression in my early 20s, what got me through in the end was going, okay, everything else feels rubbish. Everything feels rubbish. But the one thing I know up here, even though I'm not totally feeling it down here this morning, is that Jesus loves me. And if I have any doubt at that, I can look at the cross and the fact he gave his life for me, that actually that is unquestionable. And that actually was tremendously encouraging, even though I didn't feel it. So the first thing I'd say is, yeah, Christians still have ups and downs. Life can still be tough. But I think what can get you through is knowing there is that bigger story in which that makes sense. And then the second half of that, I would say, related to that, is when suffering comes, which is also a big part of this question. Again, we have the choice of going, if we live in a godless universe, that suffering is entirely meaningless. Quite frankly, the chance of you getting justice in this life is pretty unlikely. We live in a world in which ultimately evil is going to triumph. It may not triumph today, but it will eventually triumph tomorrow, because that will be the story. Everything ends ultimately in destruction. If not today, then tomorrow. If not tomorrow, then eventually when the sun expands and swallows the earth and everything is over. On the Christian faith, there's that sense of going, okay, there may be some suffering now because of where we are in the grand scheme of things, but we can also hope as Christians and know as Christians that suffering is not the last word. And that can be tremendously encouraging. And one of the lessons that's been taught to me recently is the church that we attend down south has a lot of Ukrainians in it. We've got a big Ukrainian community in Sweden. Talking to Ukrainian Christians, Ukrainian families who could tell you a thing or two about suffering when your home has been blown to pieces, to hear them talk about the difference that faith makes when you've lived through what you have done has taught me a lesson or two, who's had a fairly comfortable existence in the grand scheme of things. So yeah, I wish it was simple as become a Christian, everything is rainbows and unicorns, but I think it is become a Christian and it gives you a resource for coping with suffering. And actually Friedrich Nietzsche, who I quoted earlier, that influential atheist, Nietzsche's fascinating, didn't believe in God, but said some amazing things. Nietzsche once said, the person who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. In other words, if you have figured out the purpose of life and why you are here and what those bigger questions are, then when life does throw you curveballs, it is much easier to be resilient than if you haven't got that why figured out. So I hope some of that helps. It was a brilliant question. Thank you for that. I said a couple of things reflecting on that. So Alejandro, it's a darn good question. I mean, I think in one sense where I began tonight was, I think, teasing out a little bit about what happiness does mean. That's what I guess Aristotle was trying to do with that fourfold framework that I then played with this evening. Because I'm conscious there are so many words we use in society that we don't unpack. Happiness is one, love is another good one, right? And we don't go, what does that word mean? One way I think one problem we have in our society, particularly in the West, is we've confused happiness and joy. Because I remember the first time I went to the Far East, went to India for the first time, and hanging out with people, Indian Christians living in the slums of Delhi, whose lives were on every conceivable metric, just horrific. But the joy that I discovered there and saw in them put me as a Westerner to shame. I'm thinking, okay, so it can't simply be having the latest iPhone and a large screen TV and everything comfortable, because these guys don't have any of these things. So I think it comes from something much deeper. I think I prefer to think in terms of joy, and joy is something that's so deep it can transcend circumstances. I think we live in a culture that tries to buy us off with happiness when what many of us want is joy. Where does joy come from? I don't think it can ultimately be purely self-provided. I think it has to come from without. That's back to the 4 levels idea. I think it has to come from outside as a gift, which is why if you don't believe in some kind of God, you run into problems. And interesting, I mentioned one atheist this evening, Friedrich Nietzsche. One of my other favorite atheists is a name that may be known to some of you here this evening, especially those of you who have a Christian faith, and that's a guy called C.S. Lewis. And Lewis, well-known Christian writer, also wrote the Narnia stories. Many people don't realize that he was a hardcore committed atheist for the first 30 years of his life. Very hardcore committed atheist. Eventually comes to faith over a journey of 3 or 4 years. Then when he writes this story, his autobiography of how that happened, he called his autobiography Surprised by Joy. And it's a beautiful story of he began realizing that joy, not happiness, joy was turning up in his life in unexpected places. Particularly he would find it through literature, through music, through beauty and art, the things that really moved him. And as a deep thinker, he began asking the question, where is this coming from? I may be experiencing through the painting or through the story, but it's coming through that. What is it? And it was actually chasing down the joy question that led him to discover the God behind the universe, and then ultimately Jesus himself. So I love the fact that joy for him was the key thing. So I would say joy, and it needs to be as a gift from without. Max, that's a good observation. I think there is some of that going on. And I think that's perhaps the joy and the joy and the happiness piece, that happiness can come and go, whereas I think joy is that sort of deeper sense of peace that can come through circumstances. And again, actually interesting, having just in the last 4 years lost 3 really good friends to cancer, all way too young, and in all 3 cases being quite impressed actually by watching them die and watching the peace that was there because they were Christians and had this unshakable faith in Christ. That didn't mean they sat there going, yay, I've got cancer, but that going, actually, it's okay. So the happiness would have been way down here. On days when chemotherapy is hitting, happiness is not on your radar. So I think the happiness can come and go. And I think one of the big questions for us when it comes to happiness and joy is finding that happiness and that security and that peace that transcends circumstances. Most of us look for happiness in things that will get taken away. And that's one of the problems. So if your happiness purely resides in a relationship, well, tragically, there's a chance that person may die before you. If it's in a job that you love, we live in an economy, that job may not be there tomorrow. If you love playing a particular sport, sometimes bad things happen or your health fades. And I think we do, live in this culture that encourages us to sort of set as the final destination a thing that is at best transitory. But like I said at the end, the great thing then, Mags, if you then find what the answer to life really is, and I believe that relationship with Christ, then what that sets you free to do is I can celebrate those things when they come. So if it's a relationship that's meaningful to me right now, brilliant, I can enjoy it. If I'm doing well at playing sport right now, I can enjoy it. But it's not everything. And if it then gets taken away, then I don't go, well, that's everything now, there's no point living. I go, okay, different season of life. So again, I think separating out happiness and joy, like we talked about a moment ago, helps with some of that too. Oh gosh, there's a question. What's your name, sir? Sorry? Dave. A couple of things. I think that I've had a good life kind of thing. I think one of the challenges there is, of course, okay, I would say to somebody, that's lovely, but then what do you say to somebody who hasn't? Because that sounds profoundly selfish, quite frankly. I remember about 5 years ago doing a big university debate on this topic, actually, at the University of Hull. And there was myself, and there was an atheist journalist, and in fact the head of the British Humanist Association. About 600 students there that night, and it was an amazing dialogue we had. And he actually went that kind of route. He went, well, I don't need God. I've got a nice house, my job's great, I love gardening, all these things. And I'm just looking at him and going, that sounds lovely. That's a lovely middle-class Islington lifestyle, mate. What do you say to, my Ukrainian friends? I mean, Ukraine hadn't happened then. What do you say to people whose life is actually fairly crappy? Because that sounds really arrogant, quite frankly, to go, I'm okay, Jack, you aren't. That's the first challenge, if that's all it's about. Then when it comes down to goodness, do you know, it's interesting. Most people I meet want to be good. Right? On the one hand, we live in a society where sort of morality is all over the place. But I've never yet met a person who goes, yeah, I want to be a bad person. I want to be a real, nightmare scumbag. In fact, my role model is Vladimir Putin. I've got his picture on my wall. We all generally want to be thought of as decent. But that raises the question of who gets to decide what decent's like is the first challenge, right? If I'm allowed to sort of shoot the arrow at the wall behind Matty's head over here and then draw the target afterwards, I'm an Olympic quality archer, mate. That's dead easy. And it's the same with goodness. If I get to define what goodness is like, then of course I'm a good person. But what if it's more complicated than that? And then the question becomes, have I really had a good life? I mean, all of us, if we're honest, have hurt people. There's things that we've said and thought and done. There's perhaps relationships we haven't been proud of. It gets a bit more complicated at this point, right? And then what do we do with that reality that actually all of us are more complex? And what I would say, that here's the great thing and where the Christian faith comes in again into play. I think the biggest problem at heart in our society when it comes to happiness or when it comes to goodness is we live in this age of performance-based acceptance. We live in this age that says if you perform, then you're accepted. So, if you perform, we like you. If you say the right thing on social media, we like you. If you, believe the right things politically, we like you. Here are the standards. You measure up and you're accepted. If you don't, then you'll be on the pale. And I just think that is a devastating place to base identity because you can never be secure and you can never know that you're really loved for who you are. Along comes the Christian faith. And Jesus looks at me and looks at you and says, yeah, you know what? You have messed up, mate. You actually have messed up. That's the bad news. But the good news is I love you so much that I've done something to deal with that, and I've performed so that you don't have to. And one of my favorite little words in the Christian faith that I think our culture needs more than ever is the word grace, which is not about what I've done or you've done. It's what about Jesus has done for us. And when you get that into your DNA, it is profoundly liberating. And it does set you free, not then to do entirely as you want and just, mess up again, although we will because we're human. But I think it gives us that freedom to go, I now know that I have a security for my identity and happiness that is unshakable. So that's where I sort of begin to go on some of that. No, I think it's an observation, isn't it? I think there's a real scope in conversations, right, to be gently nudging people on the question, is there more to life than this? Because I think sometimes people default to cynicism, right? Like the best I can get is the pub on a Saturday night and a couple of drinks with my mates. That is all that life has on offer, which to me is such a tragic. To me, that's almost tragic, actually. If you genuinely think that's the best that's out there, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's like that you've allowed the society to tell you that's the best there is. So could it just be the case that there's something more? And then what I find interesting is, Matty, is almost every society, every culture, every sort of group and neighborhood I find myself hanging out in, is there's also little hints, though, that people believe there's more than that. There's little moments of sort of spirituality. Christmas is an interesting one. The street we live in Swindon. I mean, some of the broken, troubled lives on our street are just awful. There's people really wrestling with stuff. But Christmas, the lights come out. People actually do it. The village church is actually packed in our community. Give people a hint of something, and I think people grab hold of it. I think there's other signs where you see people reach out for stuff. And then I had a recent example, a personal example of this just before lockdown. A mate and I had booked an afternoon to go and do some fishing on Loch Tay, and really not knowing what we're doing, we clubbed together and hired a boat guy to take us out for a couple of hours and do some fishing. And he got chatting to us in the boat, this guy we'd hired. He was like, what do you do? And I said, I always describe myself as a sort of vicar, because that's the best thing. I'm sort of vicar. I'm like a church leader without church. And then my mate was a vicar. And this guy's like, oh man, I got two religious nutters on my boat for the afternoon. I was like, oh, so you don't You don't believe in anything. Oh no, 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 mate. I don't believe this life is all there is. Don't believe in God. This kind of thing. Well, then my mate piped up. He said, "Oh, so when we die, I presume you believe we're like the bait here. We're just worm food, right? We just die and we go in the ground and the worms eat us, and that's it." Really interesting. This guy's like, "Oh, no, 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 no. I don't believe that. No, no. I think there's got to be something more than that." And that was really interesting. And the conversation cracked open from there. And then we sort of lent into that, and it turned out he'd gone to church as a kid and been a bit disillusioned by it. And actually, there's amazing conversation. So I think it's giving people the chance in the conversations that we have, in whatever way is appropriate for those people that you mix with in the communities you are, to try and help people see that better story. And I love that you asked me tonight to call it a better story of happiness, because I think that's quite invitational, actually, to go, what if there is a better story of happiness? I'm not knocking your story, it's a great story, but what if there is a better, bigger story, of which your story is just a hint of something bigger? Do you want to mention? Yes, that's a very good point. Thank you for that. So we've covered lots of questions this evening. It's been great to do that. Thank you for brilliant questions. If you have a question that you haven't had a chance to answer, or you're a bit nervous about raising your hand or calling out, and you've got a burning question but you haven't been able to raise it, on your seats or around your seats, you'll find these wee leaflets called "Where Do I Go From Here?" And at Solas, we produce a little resource called Short Answers. They are videos that are 5-minute videos that answer common questions about life, the universe, God, Christianity, Jesus, everything. If you just use that QR code there, that will take you to the website, the point on the website, and you can tap in your question. And we've got 180 of these now, myself and other members of the Solas team having a crack at them. There will probably be a good chance that whatever question you have, we've had a go at. If there isn't, if you've got some amazing question and it is not on there, you can use the Contact Us button on the Solas website. We always like new questions. Steve, who was introduced a moment at the start of the evening, has only just joined the team. He started filming Short Answers. We want to make him work really hard. So if you've got some great questions we haven't tackled, send them in, and we'll get a South African working on it.
Thanks so much for coming.